The violent video games cause violent children. Playing a violent game won't turn children into psychos or murderers or serial killers. It is said that violent video games may affect the form of violence, but does not cause the violence to occur. Children might mold violent acts on what they have seen in video games, but the violence would still occur in the absence of video games. I am a parent, and I feel that video games do not cause violent children. I have a couple of games that I allow my son to play. Pirates of the Caribbean, Lego Star Wars, and all the games that we have some type of violence in them. And my son is not a violent person. I believe there are 3 main points everyone should know about how violent video games do not cause violent children. And they are that most of the research on whether video games encourage violence is unsatisfactory. Violent video games are a way that children can get rid of angry and stressed out feelings. And how children's mental stability and the quality of home life is more likely to affect violence. I'm going to start out by talking about how the research on whether violent games encourage violence is unsatisfactory. Time magazine says that the researchers have found that people serving time for violent crimes typically consume less media before committing their crimes than the average person. It is true that young offenders who have committed school shootings in America have also been game players, but young people in general are more likely to be gamers, 90% of boys and 40% of girls. The overwhelming majority of kids who play do not commit antisocial acts. While video game sales have skyrocketed, youth violence plummeted to its lowest levels in 40 years according to government statistics. It has been increasingly recognized that much of the early research on violent video games linked them to increased aggression was problematic. Most studies used outcome measures that had nothing to do with real-life aggression and failed to control carefully for other important variables such as family violence, mental health issues, or even gender in many studies. More recent research has not found that children who play violent video games are more violent than the other kids nor harmed in any other fashion. The Economist tells us that most of the research on whether video games encourage violence is unsatisfactory, focusing primarily on the short-term effects. In the best studies so far, frequent playing of violent games sustained over a month had no effect on participants' level of aggression. And during the period in which gaming has become widespread in America, violent crimes have fallen by half. If games really did make people violent, this tendency might be expected to show up in the figures, given that half of Americans play video games. Perhaps, as some observers have suggested, gaming actually makes people less violent by acting as a safety valve. Those were just a few facts about how research on whether violent video games encourage violence is unsatisfactory. Now we're going to talk about how violent games are a way that children can get rid of angry and stressed out feelings. Most studies show that violent games allow players to express themselves. It's like an outlet for them, in a way. All these violent actions that are said to have been inspired by playing violent games are nothing but the expression of issues unrelated to video games. Violent video games provide healthy and safe opportunities for children to virtually explore rules and consequences of violent actions. Playing violent video games reduces violence in children by serving as a substitute for rough and tumble play. Playing violent video games allows children to express aggression and establish statues in the peers group without causing physical harm. According to www.southeastpsych.blog, tells us that extensive study found no support for the hypothesis of violent video game playing is associated with higher aggression. In fact, that same study found some positive benefits of playing violent video games, particularly improvements in visual thinking. While there are studies that find people who play violent games may have a brief increase in violent thoughts and feelings, newer research finds that these thoughts and feelings typically last less than 4 minutes. And remember, having a violent thought is a whole lot different than actually committing violence. Now we are going to talk about how children's mental stability and the quality of home life is more likely to affect violence. Exposure to violent video games has not been shown to be predictive of violent behavior or crime. Any link found between video games and violence is best explained by other variables such as exposure to family violence and aggressive personality. According to a 2007 U.S. Surgeon General's report, the strongest risk factor for school shootings centered on mental stability and the quality of home life, not violent video games. The moral panic over violent video games is doubly harmful. It has led adult authorities to be more suspicious and hostile to many kids who already feel cut off from the system. It has also misdirected energy away from eliminating the actual causes of youth violence and allowing problems to continue to fester. The level of control granted to video game players, especially in terms of pace and directions, their actions, their character, allows youth to regulate their emotion state during play. Researchers show that a perception of being controlled reduces emotion and stressful responses to events. Today I have discussed 3 main points everyone should know about how violent video games do not cause violent children. And those were how most of the research on whether video games encourage violence is unsatisfactory. Violent video games are a way that children can get rid of angry and stressed out feelings. And children's mental stability and the quality of home life is more likely to affect violence. Now remember, in children, there is a difference between aggressive behavior like pushing or shoving and real violence like hitting, which causes bodily harm. But the key factor regarding video gaming is that we simply do not have enough research at this point to form conclusions.